What if one man had truly conquered the world? No rivals, no borders, just the dream of a god in human form. Alexander, the man who almost rewrote history. Chapter 1. The Conquest That Never Stopped. The world remembers him as a conqueror, a young king who moved like a storm across continents, carving empires where none had dared to dream. But history tells us only half the story. It tells us where he stopped, not where he could have gone. Imagine for a moment that Alexander the Great did not die in Babylon at the age of 32. Imagine that fever never touched his skin, that destiny hesitated for just one heartbeat more. The torch of conquest still burned in his eyes, and the world was far from enough. Had he lived, the great Macedonian would have turned eastward once again. The Indus was only the edge of his ambition, not its end. The maps of his dreams stretched to lands his generals whispered about, golden kingdoms beyond the Himalayas, and an empire in the mist where dragons guarded silk and porcelain. China. He would have marched toward it, his army a tide of iron and will. Cities would fall, not to destruction, but to transformation, for Alexander conquered not only with the sword, but with the idea of unity. His empire had already become a living mosaic. From the temples of Egypt to the palaces of Persia, from the marketplaces of Babylon to the banks of the Indus, a new civilization was being born, part Greek, part Eastern, entirely human. If he had lived to nurture it, that world might have become something humanity had never known, a single, connected civilization. The city of Alexandria, his shining jewel on the Nile, would have grown into the beating heart of the planet. Scholars from Athens and astronomers from Babylon might have studied side by side. Indian mathematicians could have met Egyptian engineers beneath marble columns, crafting ideas that today we might call modern. Knowledge would not have been locked behind borders. It would have flowed like a river from one culture to another, guided by the vision of one man. Rome, still young and restless, would have remained in shadow. Without Alexander's death, the Roman Republic might have never risen to power. No Caesars, no empire to rival his. The legions of Rome would have been crushed before they could even dream of conquest. The very fabric of Western civilization would have been rewoven. There would have been no collapse of Rome, no centuries of darkness, no age of ignorance. Instead, the flame of science and art might have burned brighter, uninterrupted. A world enlightened long before ours ever was. And perhaps the greatest unification of all would have been language. Greek, the tongue of philosophy and reason, might have become the world's first universal language. From the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of China, poets and kings might have spoken the same words, written the same alphabets, a global tongue for a global civilization. Religion, too, might have changed. Alexander, who bowed before both Greek gods and Eastern deities, might have inspired a universal faith, one that spoke not of one god or many, but of humanity itself as divine. Chapter 2. The Birth of a Global Civilization. It began not with war, but with a vision. When Alexander's armies finally laid down their swords, the world that rose in their shadow was unlike any that had come before. A vast empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the edge of the Himalayas, connected not only by roads and trade routes, but by a shared dream, the creation of a civilization that belonged to all humankind. The young conqueror who once sought glory through conquest had now turned his ambition toward creation. He no longer wanted to destroy kingdoms. He wanted to fuse them, to turn the chaos of conquest into the harmony of civilization. From Greece came philosophy, the belief that knowledge could be reasoned, that the universe could be understood by thought and dialogue. From Egypt came science and mathematics, the wisdom of the stars and the secrets of the Nile. Persia contributed its administration, its refined sense of governance, the art of ruling vast, diverse peoples through tolerance and law. And from India came spirituality, the quiet voice that whispered of inner worlds beyond the reach of armies. Under Alexander's eternal empire, these pillars became the foundation of something entirely new, a civilization that blended logic and faith, empire and enlightenment. Imagine walking through the streets of Alexandria, now the capital of a world united. Marble avenues shimmer under the sun, libraries tower above the sea. Scholars from every corner of the earth gather here, Greek philosophers debating with Indian sages, Egyptian priests studying geometry with Babylonian astronomers. Knowledge is no longer the treasure of one kingdom. It flows like a tide between cultures. In this imagined world, learning becomes the true currency of power. Every city is a classroom, every temple a university. Education is no longer a privilege of the elite. It is the empire's lifeblood. Children of Macedonian soldiers study Sanskrit poetry. Persian scribes translate Greek tragedies. Chinese inventors share paper and silk with Western thinkers. The Hellenistic world evolves into a global academy, centuries before the word globalization would ever exist. Law, too, transforms. The Persian model of governance merges with Greek civic ideals, giving birth to a universal code, a system where justice is not bound by blood or birthplace, but by shared human dignity. The empire becomes a federation of cultures, each preserving its traditions, yet united under a single legal framework. A merchant from Athens can trade in Bactria under the same laws that protect a farmer on the Nile. The concept of citizenship expands. No longer the privilege of city or race, but the right of every soul within the empire's embrace. Religion changes its face as well. In this new order, gods are no longer enemies. They are reflections of the same divine truth. Temples of Zeus stand beside shrines of Isis and the altars of Shiva. Alexander himself, once worshipped as a son of gods, becomes a symbol of unity, the bridge between heaven and earth, between east and west. Instead of division, faith becomes a language of connection. The arts bloom in this fertile soil. Sculptors carve the faces of African kings in Greek marble. Poets write in blended tongues that sing both Homer and the Vedas. Music carries the rhythm of the Aegean, mixed with the melody of the Indus. This world does not erase difference. It celebrates it, weaving it into one grand tapestry of humanity. Trade explodes across continents. Silk from China, spices from India, gold from Africa, all flowing through one continuous network. Alexandria becomes the beating heart of commerce, the meeting point of worlds. But it is not greed that drives this expansion. It is curiosity, the urge to know, to connect, to grow. Humanity's restless hunger finally finds peace not in war, but in wonder. Yet beneath this golden age, shadows still stir. The price of such harmony is control. The empire watches over its subjects through efficient bureaucracy and silent armies. Freedom bends beneath the weight of order. To keep unity alive, dissent is silenced. Ideas flow, but only those that serve the vision of empire. The same roads that carry trade also carry surveillance. Still, the brilliance cannot be denied. This world, this Hellenistic world without end, becomes the seed of a civilization we might have inherited. Perhaps in another timeline it was so. A timeline where our languages share one root, our gods one essence, our borders nothing but lines of history. In this alternate past, humanity reached its renaissance not in Florence, but 2,000 years earlier. on the shores of the Nile, under the rule of a king who refused to die. And maybe that is the greatest irony of all. Alexander sought to rule the world through conquest, but his true legacy in this imagined world would have been creation, the birth of a civilization not divided by walls, but bound by wisdom. It was not the empire of soldiers or kings. It was the empire of thinkers, dreamers, and believers. A world reborn not by blood, but by ideas. A civilization that could have changed everything. If only he had lived a little longer. But every dream carries its shadow, for a world united under one ruler would not have been free. Alexander's empire, vast and eternal, would have demanded order above all else. His successors might have turned divine kingship into divine tyranny. Generations could have been born into loyalty, not liberty, their gods chosen by the throne, their destinies tied to the will of one man's dream. Peace, yes, but peace forged by obedience. Harmony, but harmony held by fear. The price of unity might have been the silence of rebellion. Still, the idea of Alexander's endless march haunts us. His death ended an empire, but not the ambition that shaped it. Every conqueror who came after, Caesar, Napoleon, Genghis Khan, carried a spark of that same vision, a world-made one. The sword was replaced by faith, by trade, by technology. But the march never stopped. It continues in the way nations expand, in the way cultures blend, in the way humanity still seeks to rule itself under one order. Maybe that is Alexander's true conquest, not of land, but of imagination. He showed the world that boundaries were illusions, that destiny could be bent by will. And though his body turned to dust in Babylon, his dream never died. It whispers still in every empire that rises, in every nation that claims to bring the world together. The conquest that never stopped is not one of blood anymore. It is one of ideas. Alexander began it with the sword. We continue it with our minds. And perhaps, somewhere beyond history's reach, he still marches, not across deserts, but through the corridors of time, chasing a world that finally bows, not in fear, but in unity. Chapter 3. No Rome, no Dark Ages. History often depends on who fills the silence after a great man falls. When Alexander died in Babylon, that silence gave birth to Rome. But what if that silence never came? What if Alexander's empire, vast, vibrant, unstoppable, had survived? What if the shadow of Rome had never risen at all? The Roman Republic in Alexander's lifetime was nothing more than a stubborn city-state fighting minor wars on the Italian peninsula. Its legions were still learning discipline, its senators still fighting for power within marble halls that barely echoed beyond the Tiber. But had Alexander lived, Rome would have remained forever small, just another name swallowed by the tides of empire. The world would have been ruled not by Caesars, but by successors of Alexander, kings educated in philosophy and strategy, raised not to conquer anew, but to govern a world already unified. The Roman eagle would never have flown. The legions would never have marched across Gaul or Britain. The Colosseum would never have echoed with screams. And perhaps, most fatefully, the fall of Rome, that great collapse that plunged Europe into darkness, would never have happened. Without the rise of Rome, there could be no dark ages. The chain of history would never have broken. Imagine Europe, not fragmented into feudal kingdoms, but remaining part of a vast Hellenistic federation. Roads would still connect the Mediterranean to the east. Trade would flow without interruption. Scholars in Athens could correspond with scientists in Alexandria, philosophers in Babylon, mathematicians in India. Knowledge would not burn with the library of Alexandria. it would multiply. In this alternate world, the word Renaissance would not describe a rebirth, because knowledge would never have died in the first place. Greek philosophy would have continued its dialogue with Eastern logic, evolving centuries before the first medieval university. The theories of Archimedes, Aristotle, and Euclid would have been built upon, not forgotten. Astronomy, medicine, and mathematics would have advanced not in fits and starts, but in continuous ascent. By 200 BC, humankind might have reached what our real world did not achieve until the 1400s, an early age of reason, centuries ahead of time. Picture it, marble observatories rising above desert sands, engineers building water-powered machines to harvest crops, scholars experimenting with optics, magnetism, and steam. The first mechanical clock could have ticked in Babylon 2,000 years before it did in Europe. The great cathedrals of the Middle Ages would instead have been marble academies dedicated to knowledge, not penance, and art. Oh, what art it would have been! Without Rome's fall, there would be no Gothic shadows, no centuries of religious fear. Artists would not paint saints to survive. They would paint the cosmos to understand it. The sculpture of the Greeks would merge with the mysticism of the East. Frescoes would depict not divine judgment, but the harmony of worlds, man, earth, and stars in one eternal design. Language, too, would follow a different path. Latin, the tongue of empire, would never rise to dominance. Instead, Greek, already the language of thought, would become the world's intellectual thread. The Bible, when it was written, might have been composed in Greek and Sanskrit together, a holy book of two worlds. Religion itself would transform. Without the Roman Church to shape Western faith, Christianity might have remained a philosophy rather than an institution, a movement of minds, not monarchs. The wars of creed that tore through Europe for centuries might never have scarred the world at all. Instead of crusades, there might have been councils of reason. Instead of division, a quiet pursuit of understanding. The very notion of progress would change. In our world, humanity's knowledge was lost and rediscovered, cycles of light and darkness, creation and collapse. But in Alexander's world, that cycle would break. Civilization would move forward in a steady rhythm, guided by scholars instead of kings. The inventions that came in the 15th century, printing, navigation, gunpowder, the telescope, might have emerged 1,000 years earlier. By the time our timeline reached the Middle Ages, Alexander's world could have been exploring the stars. But even perfection carries its price. A world without Rome might also be a world without resistance, without the raw, defiant spirit that rebellion breeds. Rome gave birth to republics, to law, to the idea that no man is above the state. In a world ruled by Alexander's heirs, that flame might never have sparked. Humanity could have lived in order, but perhaps without liberty. Knowledge might have flourished, but only under the watchful eye of empire. And so we face a paradox. Without Rome, the world might have advanced faster, become wiser, more peaceful. Yet it might also have lost something essential: the struggle, the chaos, the will to question authority. History, in its strange wisdom, chose both light and shadow. The rise of Rome, the fall of Rome, and the rebirth that followed centuries later. But sometimes, when we look at the ruins of empires and the libraries burned to ash, we can't help but wonder, what if the torch of knowledge had never fallen? What if the Renaissance had dawned 2,000 years earlier? What if the world had never known the Dark Ages at all? Maybe somewhere, in another thread of time, the lamps of learning never went out. Maybe, in that world, the stars were mapped long before our telescopes, and mankind learned the secrets of flight before it ever learned to pray. And maybe, Just maybe, that was the world Alexander once saw when he dreamed of conquering eternity. Chapter 4. A unified religion of reason and gods. Every empire seeks to rule the body, but Alexander, he wanted to rule the soul. To most kings, conquest ends with borders. To Alexander, conquest began where belief was born. He saw temples not as trophies of war, but as bridges between worlds. In Egypt, he bowed before Amun. In Babylon, he offered prayers to Marduk. In India, he sought the wisdom of Brahmin sages. To his men, this was diplomacy, but to Alexander, it was revelation. He saw what no conqueror before him had ever seen, that gods were not enemies, but reflections of the same light, seen through different eyes, that Zeus and Ra, Ahura Mazda and Vishnu were not rivals. They were names of the same eternal truth. And so, in his dream of empire, a new idea began to take shape. A faith beyond division, a religion not born of tribe or temple, but of reason and wonder. Imagine a world where that dream did not die with him. After Alexander's survival, the world he ruled would have needed not just laws and languages, but meaning, a shared spirit to bind its people. And so, from the sands of Egypt to the mountains of India, priests and philosophers would have gathered to forge the first universal religion, a synthesis of heaven and mind. From Greece, it would inherit humanism, the belief that the divine lives within man, that reason and curiosity are sacred acts. From the East, it would draw mysticism, the quiet understanding that truth cannot only be thought, but felt. And from Egypt, it would borrow ritual, the poetry of faith, the ceremonies that give the invisible a shape. Together, these threads would weave a tapestry of belief unlike any the world had ever known. No single god upon a throne, but a circle of wisdom, where divinity and logic walk hand in hand. In this world, temples would become schools of enlightenment, not shrines of fear. Instead of asking, "What does God demand?" priests would ask, "What can we learn from God's design?" Prayer would evolve into meditation, worship into reflection. The act of studying the stars, healing the sick, or questioning the universe would itself be seen as devotion. Science would not stand against faith. It would be faith. Picture Alexandria, the heart of this new religion. Marble pillars rising above the blue waters of the Nile. Pilgrims from every nation arriving not to sacrifice animals, but to offer knowledge. Scrolls, inventions, discoveries. The library would be the holiest temple, the philosopher, the high priest, and at the center of it all, the belief that reason itself was divine, that understanding the universe was to touch the face of the gods. Festivals would honor not victory in battle, but achievements of the mind, the discovery of new stars, the invention of new machines, the writing of great works. Instead of holy wars, there would be holy debates, where faiths and philosophies met not in conflict, but in dialogue. Imagine children in Bactria learning geometry as a spiritual discipline, or astronomers in Thebes mapping the heavens as an act of worship. The lines between the sacred and the scientific would blur until they became one. And the gods? Oh, the gods would change too. No longer carved into separate pantheons, they would merge into archetypes of understanding. Zeus, the force of reason. Ra, the fire of creation. Shiva, the cycle of transformation. Athena, the wisdom that guides them all. Every people would see their own reflection within this shared divine mosaic. Such a faith could have unified humanity not through conquest, but through comprehension. It would have been a religion where belief and logic were brothers, where the soul's greatest sin was ignorance, and its highest virtue was curiosity. But even this golden faith would not be without shadows. An empire that defines truth risks silencing those who seek another path. When reason becomes holy, dissent becomes heresy. And perhaps in time, the priests of logic might grow as rigid as those of myth. They might guard knowledge as jealously as their ancestors guarded temples, turning enlightenment into orthodoxy. For even in a world of reason, the human heart still hungers for mystery, for something beyond proof, something eternal. Yet, for a time, that dream would have shone like a second sun, an age where scholars and prophets spoke the same language, where to study was to pray, and to discover was to believe. And maybe that is the world Alexander wanted to leave behind. Not an empire of soldiers, but of seekers. A civilization united not by sword or flag, but by faith in the power of the human mind. The religion of reason and gods, a divine harmony between thought and wonder. A faith that could have changed the soul of mankind forever, if only the conqueror who dreamed it had lived long enough to see it bloom. Chapter 5. A Different Modern World. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a world that never fragmented. A world where Alexander's dream did not die in Babylon, but lived on, evolving through centuries. A world not divided by continents and colors, but united by a single civilization. Not the modern age we know, but a different modern world, born from one ancient empire that never fell. In this world, the 21st century would not begin with skyscrapers of steel and glass, but with monuments of marble and logic, cities built on symmetry, harmony, and purpose. The skyline of this alternate Earth would be an architectural symphony, domes like those of Alexandria, bridges patterned after Persian geometry, and gardens stretching like those once dreamed in Babylon. Greek engineering would have refined itself for 2,000 years, creating not just buildings, but living structures. Cities powered by wind, sun, and water, designed not for greed, but for balance. Technology would have advanced, yes, but it would have been beautiful. Democracy, too, would be unrecognizable from what we know. In our world, it rose in Greece, died in empire, and was reborn centuries later in the chaos of revolution. But in Alexander's world, democracy would never have died at all. It would have grown, nurtured by Persian administration and Indian philosophy, into something greater, a global federation where city-states and provinces governed themselves under one ancient constitution. The concept of nations might never have existed. There would be no flags, no borders, no wars for identity. Instead, every region would send voices to a grand council, a parliament of humanity, bound not by power, but by wisdom. And perhaps most fascinating of all, the world might have spoken one language, Greek enriched by the vocabularies of Persian, Sanskrit, and Egyptian tongues, evolving through millennia into a perfect medium for science, art, and diplomacy. A universal language that united every continent, from the deserts of Arabia to the forests of Europe, from the Himalayas to the Atlantic coast. Imagine a planet where translation is no longer a barrier, where thought itself moves freely, like music understood by all. Education would not be a privilege of the few. It would be a birthright, the empire's greatest invention. Every child, regardless of birth or class, would be raised within the same system that once produced philosophers and mathematicians. Science would not compete with faith, it would be faith, a continuation of the unified religion of reason that emerged in the empire's golden age. To learn would be to serve the divine. To question would be to honor truth. The classroom, not the battlefield, would have shaped the destiny of mankind. Technology, too, would follow a different course. Without centuries of war and division, invention would have flowed without interruption. Steam power, electricity, and flight, all might have come 1,000 years earlier. By now, humankind might not be exploring Mars as pioneers, but as citizens of a cosmic federation. Alexander's empire, rooted in curiosity and connection, would have reached the stars not through conquest, but through collaboration. Economy would serve humanity, not the other way around. Trade, once the lifeblood of the empire, would evolve into a system of shared prosperity, a balance of craftsmanship and philosophy. We would measure success not in currency, but in contribution. A philosopher's idea would hold the same value as an engineer's invention. And greed, the curse that fractured our real world, might have been tempered by 2,000 years of moral discipline taught by the schools of the empire. Cities would pulse not with chaos, but with rhythm. Imagine streets lined with marble colonnades, not advertising screens. Open forums for dialogue instead of social media divides. People from every culture sharing ideas face to face, not behind digital walls, but beneath starlit courtyards. The internet, had it existed, would not be a marketplace of distraction, but a temple of knowledge. A living library of Alexandria, reborn in the digital age. And yet, perfection always demands its price. In a world united for so long, would individuality survive? Would dissent be celebrated or feared? Perhaps after centuries of harmony, humanity would crave difference once again. A spark of rebellion might flicker in the hearts of those who wanted chaos, freedom, and unpredictability, the very things that make us human. Still, it is difficult not to marvel at what might have been. A 21st century shaped by Greek reason, Persian governance, and Indian soul, a planet without wars of nations or faiths, without poverty born of greed, a civilization not obsessed with progress, but with purpose. Maybe we would have lived in peace, not the fragile peace of treaties, but the enduring peace of understanding. Maybe the word empire would no longer mean domination, but cooperation, a federation of knowledge that began 2,000 years ago, under one name, Alexander. And perhaps when we look at our fractured world today, divided by borders, languages, and ideologies, we can almost hear the echo of that other timeline. The hum of a civilization that never fell, the whisper of an empire that learned to think, to build, to believe together. A world not ruled by kings, but by wisdom. A modern age that began long before ours ever did. A different modern world, the world that might have been. Chapter 6. The Price of Eternal Empire. Every golden age hides its shadow. Even the brightest empire casts a darkness beneath its light. Alexander's world, vast, enlightened, eternal, promised unity. It offered mankind one civilization, one language, one dream. But power, even when born from genius, carries its own disease. And the greater the power, the more subtle its corruption. In this alternate history where Alexander never died, centuries would pass under a single rule. His descendants, the divine heirs of the great king, would inherit not his brilliance, but his hunger. The empire, so perfectly built, would need perfection to survive, and perfection demands obedience. At first, the unity would feel divine, a world without war, without borders, the temples of knowledge glowing in every city. But peace, enforced too long, becomes stillness. Stillness becomes silence. When all thought must serve order, creativity becomes rebellion. The philosopher who once questioned the gods would now fear the priests of reason. The scientist who once gazed at the stars might be told which truths were permitted to shine. For when reason becomes sacred, heresy becomes thought itself, the very dream of harmony. that bound east and west might harden into something else: control. To protect the empire's peace, armies would patrol its own heartlands. To preserve its culture, rulers would erase the inconvenient ones. Diversity, once celebrated, might be managed. Curiosity, once divine, might be tamed. And then would come the whispers of succession. No empire, no matter how eternal, escapes the ambitions of blood. Generations of divine kings, each claiming to carry Alexander's flame, would turn against one another. Wars not for conquest, but for legitimacy. Brother against brother, philosopher against philosopher, all beneath the marble halls of a civilization that forgot why it was born. Slavery, too, would remain, but perfected. Not chains of iron, but chains of ideology. People enslaved not by force, but by belief in the empire's destiny. A gilded cage, so beautiful that none would notice the bars. Perhaps even Alexander himself, had he lived to old age, would have seen it, the slow turning of his dream into tyranny. He would have walked the marble streets of his own Utopia and wondered, did I free mankind or bind it forever? For unity, when eternal, leaves no room for change, and a world that does not change, no matter how brilliant, slowly dies. The empire that conquered time would finally be conquered by it, not in battle, but in silence, not destroyed, but forgotten, like a god who became too perfect to be loved. And yet, the echo of that dream would never fade, because in every empire that rose after, in every mind that longed for order, there lived the ghost of Alexander, whispering of unity, of greatness, of a world made whole. The price of eternal empire is not war nor ruin. It is the loss of wonder, the moment humanity stops dreaming, because it already believes it has achieved perfection. That is how even the greatest empire dies. Not with a sword, but with a sigh.